Good day, everybody. This is Megan Dotson to welcome you to the mental health webinar series we're putting on. I hope you're all well. Today we're going to have Sean Bear and Ray Daw presenting on Healing the Returning Warrior, Keys to Understanding Unique Challenges and Strengths of American Indian and Alaska Native Veterans. And this is actually part 5 of our series that we've been doing over the last several months. And today we're going to focus on all of our webinars are recorded. So if you do ever miss a session, you can always go back and view it at a later date via our webpage, just to let you guys know. So the training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We are part of the MHTTC network, which also includes these 10 regional centers, a network coordinating office in the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. The project is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and so the content that is developed by the presenters is not necessarily their opinions, and they do not express and reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. In the next couple of days, we'll send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended, which includes a link to the recording, the handouts of the slides, and a CEU request form. Our center is a NADAC certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with any CEUs you request for a $15 fee. Immediately following today's webinar, you'll be redirected to our GIPRA evaluation. This survey takes just a few minutes to complete and asks about your satisfaction with this event. Feedback is critical to our future work, and we value your opinion. We would greatly appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts with us if you could. So you will be muted for the duration of this webinar, so please use the chat pod as you're currently doing to share your questions and comments. And we will have time today to have questions at the end because we extended this webinar to an hour and a half. So we'll address any questions then or at appropriate times within the presentation. So our first speaker today is Mr. Ray Daw, and he is a member of our advisory council and one of our major consultants. Ray's been in the behavioral health field for about 35 years, working with the Navajo Nation, nonprofits, and most recently in Alaska. His work in behavioral health has been heavily geared towards developing native trauma-appropriate approaches that are healing and effective in tribal behavioral health prevention, intervention, and treatment services. Our other speaker today is Mr. Sean Bear. He's the co-director of our MHTTC, and Mr. Bear has worked as an administrator and counselor in EAP as a counselor in adolescent behavioral disorder programs, substance abuse, and in-home family therapy. He has experience in building holistic Native American-based curriculum and implementing these curriculum program into substance abuse treatment and prevention programs. He's also an Army veteran of 9 years and was honorably discharged from the 82nd Airborne. So we want to thank these two veterans, first of all, for their service and for their continued work to provide this for each other. Thank you so much, Sean and Ray. I look forward to hearing this module, and I will let you guys take it away.
Want to go ahead and begin, Sean?
Okay, so here's an overview of the training. That was 5 modules that were given to the Return Warrior. It's really designed for about 2.5 to 4 days of training. We do that also as a TOT. So when we go somewhere, if there's Native veterans within the audience, they're interested in training this in their area for their tribes, something like that, we kind of enlist them with us in order to help us train this in their area. That way it's more culturally adapted to their area. So the first part was historical overview of natives in warfare or the military. This one here, of course, is trauma, historical trauma, and PTSD. but there are three others which we have been doing to the last few months: is approaches to assessment and treatment, traditional beliefs and healing practices, and healing the healer. Okay, so we begin to go through with trauma, then historical trauma and PTSD and treatment. We really wanted to kind of stress that because we're working with natives, we need to remember that trauma, historical trauma, and PTSD is, we need to look at it more as compounded. So we have all these different factors coming into play. Module 2, first of all, defines trauma, describes adverse childhood experiences, describes historical trauma, and also describes PTSD. Okay, objective 1, define trauma. The purpose is to review what trauma is and how it is described. Okay, looking at trauma, so cultural trauma is an attack on the very fabric of our society, affecting, in a sense, who we are as a community, as a member, as a nation. So we did go into looking at historical trauma, which is the cumulative exposure of traumatic events that affected an individual and continues to affect the subsequent generations. So if we look at many times at historical trauma ancestors, what they have gone through in many battles, war, all the trauma that they had faced within their lifetime of losing loved ones, their way of life, even like our taking away our religion for a while, that really hurt us because in effect then we weren't able to kind of keep all of the knowledge going within that time. So we see it affecting us today, and especially the youth. So intergenerational trauma occurs when trauma is not resolved. So it's subsequently internalized and passed from one generation to the next. So it is passed through, in a sense, of DNA. So the present trauma, what is vulnerability native peoples are experiencing on a daily basis. So that might be remembering our ancestors, remembering how much land we had before, or our way of life, and sometimes can be a daily reminder of how we live our life today and what we have lost. Okay, so what is trauma? It's an emotional response to events. Immediate after event is common to experience denial or some sense of shock. So when something happens to us, it's normally something that goes against what we believed before. It's something that really changes the fabric, in a sense, or how we believe things to be. And then all of a sudden there's this great change. And of course, change is hard, especially in something like this. It's a shock. So long-term reactions may include flashbacks, emotions, dreams, maybe the fear, anger, may affect relationships. But also looking at that is there's other traumas, considering looking at relationships while we were in the military. We had all these friends. We had built a new family. In a sense, leaving, then we also leave that. But the longer you're in the military too, the more you become part, in a sense, of that social or community type of living. So when you come back home, especially if you're like to a reservation or homeland, then it can be a shock because, in a sense, it's very different. You no longer have the ability to do the things you did before, and also it's, you might think of it as chaotic. So physical forms may include headaches, nausea, which are normal response to life-changing events. Okay, so trauma. How do I know and I or another needs assistance with trauma, a lot of times it's like look at how people experience that difficulty. So maybe they're having a difficulty in forgetting or moving past what had happened before. So in a sense, it affects their lives. They may experience fear or other difficult emotions that emerge unpredictably. So sometimes maybe also we experience something within our life that elicits the same kind of response or emotional response, the thinking that we had once before. So maybe if you're in a crowd or in an area where there's a lot of commotion, you might begin to feel that anxiety or tension. So maybe wanting to protect yourself, something, or looking ahead in every little thing that you can plan what might happen so you're prepared for it. So these emotions may affect their lives and the lives of others as they interfere with our relationships with others. So sometimes it's like if we're out with somebody and they see us act agitated or something like that, they might wonder whether they should be around us at all. But also at the same time as isolation kind of begins because there's so many people that are so different from us and don't understand. And of course, that affects us. So experiencing bad dreams, nightmares, or hallucinations related to the traumatic event. A lot of times those things might come about and what had happened before in our dreams. So it's almost like flashbacks, but they're within the dream state. So also hallucinations. So somebody might wake up or all of a sudden see the same thing, what had happened before, or maybe they see the whole environment as different. So persistent feelings of hopelessness, distress, which interfere with daily life functions, responsibilities, or those activities previously found enjoyable. So we come back home, things we used to enjoy, they're not enjoyable anymore. Sometimes it's like maybe our mind is caught up on certain things, so we don't really recognize those things the same way. So, what are some of the risks involved? Previously experiencing a traumatic experience, under stress, experience a traumatic event as a child, increases the risk, may set the stage for experiencing further trauma if it was not resolved, as it can be carried over into adulthood. So through you need to look at it through the lifespan. What had happened to us while we're young? Because sometimes these traumas can build up over time. So each time they happen, they it's like we almost store them in a sense, not getting over them. So we carry that from one event to another, and we kind of begin to see how it's affecting our lives, but we may not see it itself. Others may. So remembering that it has been found that trauma can be passed from two family members through interactions with survivors of trauma, not only children but parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and other significant relationships. Because when we come into a household, like we come back home, of course we're going to be different. Of course we're going to think differently. The way we react might not be the same as it used to be. We don't have the patience anymore because of what is going on with us within internally. So it can react, and we might react in different ways. So those around us will begin to see that. Maybe children kind of shy away and thinking, "Oh, dad or mom isn't the same as they used to be." Our parents might see us and thinking of, "Oh, where's that little boy or girl who they had shiny eyes and they were so happy and stuff like that," but don't see that anymore. So other family members might see the same thing, or seeing us acting agitated or something and thinking we're under stress. So they also might kind of steer away as well. So trauma can be passed through the genes, being heritable. So remembering that is like we can also pass those down to our children. So it's just like with in a sense with historical trauma, but it's looking at the next generation, as historical trauma looks at many generations. So this is called intergenerational trauma and can be traced back decades to the family. And also, I think, must have been about a year and a half ago, they also came out with some information where epigenetic memories can be passed down 14 consecutive generations. So trauma, American Indians appear to experience trauma or traumatic events at a higher rate than what was previously reported in the general population. And there are many different kind of situations for that, whether before we were growing up within our tribe, how we were seen out in public or around other people, non-natives, plus while we're in the military, what has happened because of how we are seen while we're in the military. Okay, so Ray?
Okay. That's a very good overview of trauma, Sean, and thank you very much for giving us a really good description of trauma. We, I believe a lot of us on this webinar, probably most of us, if not all of us, do a lot of work around understanding this topic, trauma.
Ray?
Yeah.
Ray, sorry to interrupt, but it's a little hard to hear you. You're really, really low volume at the moment.
Okay, how about now? As I was
Still
saying,
can't.
Oh, that's better. Yep.
Okay. I appreciate Sean's overview of this topic and really giving us a good description of how trauma is conceptualized.
Oh, Ray.
What?
Ray, sorry. It sounded good there for a minute, but now it's still hard to hear you.
Turn up my mic.
I remember it has something to do with Sean on mute.
Yeah, I got it up, and so we have a lot of us who work at understanding trauma begin that process by looking for root causes, and in this particular graphic, that we have a number of root causes that are shown to us: substance abuse, violence, suicide, child abuse, neglect, rigid religious practices, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, school dropout. There are underlying causes, and then the underlying causes are losses, historical trauma, and unresolved grief. That's how we proceed to identify some of the root causes of trauma. And from that, like Sean mentioned earlier, we begin to define trauma accordingly, culturally, historically, intergenerationally, and present. In trauma work, a number of us believe, I think a few of us believe, that acculturation assessments are really valuable to do. We as Native people, and basically any other person in the world, are acculturated in various ways to the societies and that we live in. And natives, we have extensive acculturation variation. And so acculturation assessments allow for providers to assess the cultural identity of a patient consumer. And that helps us get a better understanding of the cultural context from which symptoms that a traumatized patient is presenting are rooted, where they're coming from. And in addition to that, whether a patient identifies as traditional, bicultural, or acculturated may have an impact on their treatment preference. For example, an acculturated patient who has no understanding of tribal traditions, culture, values, and lifestyle wouldn't resonate well, like probably to traditional modalities like sweat lodge or smoke or smudging, and that's how it is. There's not a value judgment statement. It's not anything that's right or wrong. That is how we as a people have a lot of variation in our acculturation process. On the other hand, also a person who's traditionally grounded, very traditionally grounded, meaning they speak their tribal language primarily or only, they practice their traditional spiritual cultural ways daily, wouldn't resonate or wouldn't find effectiveness in a psychoanalytic style of intervention, and would have little and would have little effect from it because they're so well grounded in the traditional ways. On the other hand, all of us are acculturated in one way or another. Some of us are acculturated and cover a lot of areas. There are quite a few of us and quite a few Native Americans who practice their traditional ways either very deeply or to some degree, but also function very well in the Euro-American system, having got degrees and have finished college and from a Euro-American perspective, living effectively and successfully. And that's the breadth of acculturation that exists in Native country. And with that comes a valuing of either your American systems or the traditional systems for healing and treatment, healing or treatment. And that's where the acculturation system is really valuable to ascertain where a person is and what might be a more reasonable and effective approach to begin a treatment process or a healing process. And that's what the acculturation assessment do. And it really does have an impact on treatment preference or healing preference. Over time, a correct placement into a treatment regime or healing regime correct placement may be made as self-reports, may not always be accurate to tribal knowledge. People will say they know their tribal ways, but it turns out they may not have really good grounding on that. And that's when a psychoeducation process might be, a teaching process might be valuable to engage it with folks who have a need for that, so they can get better grounded and expand their knowledge and use of traditional ways. I mentioned this earlier, the acculturation model. You have folks that are unacculturated to the American system or unacculturated to the tribal system. On the other hand, you have folks who are acculturated to the tribal system very well or acculturated to the American system. So that scale goes either way. And you'll see that that behaviors and beliefs reflect home, country, and culture for an unacculturated person, that they're very well situated in that way. And someone who's in the middle of that continuum, partially acculturated or bicultural, more likely, is where they'll be able to move in both directions flexibly. An acculturated person has behaviors and beliefs that reflect where they come from. A Navajo and a heavily acculturated Navajo person will be living that way. They would probably very likely be Navajo healers and Navajo speaking only kind of people. We have folks like that living on the Navajo Nation and practicing their ways faithfully and daily, doing the prayers 3 times a day, and understanding the songs. So this is a good model for me to be able to figure out acculturation and where people can be, and figure ways to do acculturation assessments more effectively. Then we have enculturation and acculturation. They're two different descriptions that exist. Enculturation is the acquisition or the bringing into one's life one's own culture. I'll use this example of boarding schools. Many people who went to boarding school, after finishing boarding school, begin to acquire knowledge and skills and practice of the tribal ways. They move towards relearning language, for example, and learning tribal prayers and learning private herbs that tribal healers use. That's an enculturation, an acquisition of that. Because on boarding school, enculturation is towards the acquisition of the Euro-American system. And it's a forced process, but nonetheless, it's an enculturation process. And so we do that regularly. Enculturation is also a requirement. We have to enculturate to be able to get through life. I live on the Navajo Nation, and so for me to thrive and be effective and do well on the Navajo Nation, from my point of view, particularly with Navajos who are very, very traditional, I work to become more enculturated that way, and practicing language and things like that. Enculturation is the very first familiarization process to a particular culture. Going back to the boarding school example, when we come out of boarding school, we're acculturated in the American system in various ways, and then we begin a process of moving towards the native tribal ways, or sometimes within urban settings, we begin to learn and understand urban native lifestyle and urban native ways. And they're usually grounded on a lot of different practices. Acculturation is the amalgamation of two cultures. That's when we bring two cultures into our lives. And that acculturation model kind of describes it pretty well. And acculturation is not really essential for survival, but it is essential for us to be able to be grounded in the different ways we live and work in. Some of us who have an understanding of tribal language also work at having real good grounding on non-tribal language like English, and we're able to communicate among each other through English very well. And that's an acculturation process. We're not solely grounded in our tribal language, but we end up adopting that English as a way to communicate crosswise, and it helps us have good understanding with what we're doing, like today's webinar. Acculturation can be a familiarization of a second or even third culture. Acculturation is always involving another culture, and sometimes three. There are quite a few. A lot of our elders way back, not only here in the Southwest, a lot of our elders not only spoke like Navajo, but they also spoke different tribal languages very well around them, but also spoke English. So a lot of our native elders were trilingual or multilingual, and were able to function that way. And that's how they acculturated to the lifestyles that they had around them, and adapted to be able to trade and to be able to communicate, to be able to share ceremonies. And that's how acculturation worked. in multiculturalism, the hope is that all cultures coexist well, equally, and comfortably. And with assimilation, the expectation is that everyone adopts to a dominant culture. And we hear discussion about, there's always this tug of war, I think, between multiculturalism and assimilation. We have some folks who insist that all people who live in a particular country, whether it be America or the United States or some other place, there's always some group of people who expect anyone who comes into that country to begin to adopt that, whatever that dominant culture is. It might be language, but also lifestyle and norms and laws that are there. Within multiculturalism, there's an expectation that everyone cooperates with each other, supports each other, and get along as well as possible. So we get to objective 2, where we begin to describe adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as it's very well known. I would imagine that a number of participants here have heard of ACEs and have begun a process of incorporating ACE concepts, ACE thinking into the work you do with our people, because it really does. Childhood trauma does have negative consequences. I don't think there's any strong argument against that or counter argument to it. And what I like about the ACEs model is that it really does begin to explain the impact of childhood trauma upon an individual, whether it be a young adult or a teenager or an older adult. We carry these impacts with us in different forms and fashion. And you have a really nice graphic here that shows how those impacts can exist. I'll use today as an example. Today, our children are going through some very serious adverse childhood experiences with the pandemic that's going on, occurring in this country. I don't think there's been any time in the history of this country when, for example, schools have literally shut down for months, and there's high school students are being traumatized because they're not able to have the expected graduation ceremonies. Young kids, like elementary school kids, who begin to develop peer support systems and get friends at this time, are not able to have those playmates around them like they used to. So we're living at a time when ACEs, in particular, is an important concept to look at, and we understand as healers and treatment people what these negative consequences are, and we begin to explore within our tribes and our urban communities what those impacts will be down the line, because there will be impacts, and it's important to realize that, I think, right now. So, what is adverse childhood experiences? Adverse childhood experiences are childhood experiences, both positive and negative. Both have a tremendous impact on future violence, victimization, and perpetration, and lifelong health and opportunity. And as such, early experiences are an important public health issue. This is the CDC description of adverse childhood experiences. And it's very, very true. A number of us who researched, for example, the incidence of victimization realize that perpetrators are very likely to have a history of being victimized. And from that history of being victimized as children, will carry on the victimization and likely be perpetrators themselves. This is a very good example, whether that be with child abuse or domestic violence or sexual abuse. And this has been studied and researched and understood for decades. So adverse childhood experiences kind of wraps it, takes those ideas, research ideas, and wraps it into this framework. In the ACEs model, there are 10 adverse childhood experiences that are identified. And the 10 are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, alcohol and drug abuse by parent, a mentally ill parent, divorce, incarceration of a parent, and childhood domestic violence. And these are the 10 adverse experiences that are identified within the ACEs model and researched primarily in California about in the late 1990s. And those 10 adverse experiences are then clustered into three areas. One area is abuse, which has within physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. The second cluster is neglect, physical neglect and emotional neglect. The third cluster is household dysfunction, which is mental illness and an incarcerated relative or mother treated violently or father treated violently, parent treated violently, and substance abuse. And then the fifth thing in household dysfunction is divorce. And we can readily see these adverse experiences in the work that we do in our different settings that we work in. I mean, these are what we come across in our work with people who come to us severely distressed and anxious or depressed in their adult lives and seeking some remedy to. So the adverse childhood experiences model has a questionnaire, and the questionnaire is then scored. So basically, as an ACE score goes up, a higher score increases the risk for diseases and injuries. For example, the risk for STDs, including HIV, is increased. Gynecological problems increase, heart disease increases, diabetes, the risk for diabetes increases, the risk for stroke increases, the risk for cancer, suicide. Those are some of the chronic illnesses and diseases which are likely to be there as a person's ACEs score goes up. And when I look at the kinds of chronic conditions that exist in communities of color, let's say, Native communities especially, we see how these diseases and illnesses really do show up prominently and quite a few Native communities, whether that be rural, reservation-based, or whether that be in urban settings. We have high incidences of suicide, in some Native communities as high as 40 per 100,000. Nationally, our suicide rate is about 20 per 100,000, which is higher than other ethnic groups. Our cancer rates are really high. We have a lot of deaths due to cancer. We have significant problems with diabetes and heart disease. So for me, this kind of reflects a good part of what we see in Native country. haven't had a chance to follow the chats. So let me look at the chats really quick. Sheila Hurd says, are there individuals who are unacculturated who may be experiencing intergenerational trauma and are unaware? And would they benefit from assessment treatment? I believe, yeah, that does happen, Sheila. We have folks who are, we can have people who are not acculturated. For example, someone who's raised in an urban setting, adopted out, let's say, and they become acculturated to the American way from that adoption. And in their lifetime, they are not acculturated to the tribal ways. And we hear these stories a lot about Native kids who were put in foster care and raised in non-tribal families. Then as they become adults, because they're not unacculturated to the native ways or the tribal ways, end up developing distress and worry, anxiety, and having depression because they're not aware of the tribal ways. So we see this often, and I think the NICWA laws that are there and the NICWA program is an effort to try to remedy that to a degree. So I think that does happen, Sheila. Thank you for your question. And Maria says she appreciates the term enculturation. Nick gave a response to Emery, and would like to chat on that later. Thank you, Nick, for your point. Christy also has a comment that's very good. Thank you, Christy. And Emery again says foster care and racism and discrimination are also factors. Poverty is a huge factor in health disparities. You're right, Michelle. And that poverty comes from a number of different reasons and causes. So thank you for your comments, everybody. So going on to health disparities for Native Americans. As I mentioned earlier, we have serious major disparities with diabetes, we have adult obesity, homicide, we have alcohol-related deaths, which kill a lot of our young men especially, and more recently, more of our young women. We have youth obesity, influenza, pneumonia, as respiratory infections are very prominent among our people. And with the coronavirus going on right now, a number of Native communities are being severely impacted by that. And so this health problem that we're experiencing right now, which is changing, which has quickly changed American society and our culture for quite a while, is ravaging Native country beginning to ravage Native country pretty seriously. We have disparities with suicide that I mentioned, and we have disparities with infant mortality, smoking, prenatal care, child vaccinations. They used to be pretty significant. Like infant mortality used to be really, really, really bad. But through public health approaches and public health interventions, we have seen improvement with infant mortality, smoking rates, improvement in prenatal care, and a good improvement with child vaccinations. We haven't quite gotten a really good handle with suicide. On the other hand, so we're still seeing clusters of suicides that happen in different parts of Native country. Yes, Pamela Thurman says our major health disparities does create major risk factors for COVID-19. Very right, Pamela. Thank you for joining us. It's an honor to have you with us. Pamela's a mentor and a teacher of mine. So thank you for joining us, Pam. Some lifespan impacts of ACEs. Well, there's been a lot more work at identifying or accepting, I think, acknowledging that trauma has an impact on our brain, particularly when the trauma occurs during childhood, which is our critical and sensitive developmental period. That's when our brain's developing, is during childhood. And these adverse childhood experiences build into that impact, particularly when a child is impoverished and not well nourished and nutritionally, emotionally, culturally, and socially. That all increases a significant risk. Then genetics is a factor. Our ancestors lived a certain way, and our genetics is developed a certain way. And in the last 20 years, we've had some major movement towards acculturation and a big push towards assimilation, which continues on today. I mean, there are non-natives who demand and say that natives need to be assimilated. So these three things really impact brain development, not only in the three ways that are identified here. The brain is basically an electrical mechanism. It has electrical charges going around between the synapses, and then there's chemicals that move and adapt to the changes in our lives, like the serotonin levels that we have. Then our cellular mass, the size of the brain and the size and the kind of cells that are in the brain, begin to adapt to traumatic experiences. And the brain is wired more for flight or response, flight or fight. And that's what happens. And it becomes, as the brain adapts, our behavior adapts, and our feelings adapt, and our thinking adapts accordingly. It becomes a little more hardwired biologically. And that hardwiring can result in chronic disease, psychiatric disorders, impaired cognition, can impact school, work, like attendance, behavior, and performance. And I oftentimes think it's little wonder that we have high dropout rates among Native youth because of the ACEs experiences that a good proportion of them experience. We have problems with obesity, once again, alcohol, drugs, tobacco, risky sex, crime, and poverty, and intergenerational transmission and disparity. There's a lifespan impact of ACEs, and we see that all the time, I think. Let's see, go back to the chat here real quick. Yes, Gary, you'll be able to access the handouts. In 30 minutes. Okay. So how do we overcome ACEs? We overcome ACEs through creating for folks who are impacted by ACEs stable, nurturing relationships with caring adults can prevent and or reverse the damaging effects of toxic stress. This is not new news. This is information that's been bandied about for quite a while, and I think something we need to, it's good to keep reminding ourselves about, particularly at these times of real severe stress that many of our young people and young adults and basically all of us are experiencing right now. We're experiencing really significant stress. We can't visit relatives, and people who are in the hospital, ill or dying, are having to go through those experiences alone. And as highly social people, Native Americans, this is, I think, going to have a lasting impact on us. But we still need to create stable, nurturing relationships the best way we can with each other, with our relatives, with our friends, across the distances that we have among us. And if there's ever a time when we can work on being nurturing, this is a time to do it and act on it. So we come to the third objective. The third objective is on historical trauma, and where it's a cultural connection, and our purpose for this third module is to describe how Native Americans have generations of trauma, and that can be discussed for healing. And I have deep appreciation for having experienced this. Sean, do you have anything to add before I get into this module?
Well, I think for about healing, there's many factors I think can come into play. I mean, I know that long ago when I got out of the military, I had gone to see medicine people, and it took me a little while to be able to find the right one. A lot of times, I know the first one told me I needed to go back within my life as early as I could, to the youngest I could remember. To start where I was now and go back and look at things in my belief systems and what had bothered me in my life, different things that had hurt me. And I had to be able to kind of question those things from the information and things that I got. And from those, it took a while, but I would find one and see where my thinking was wrong, my belief system was wrong, and to kind of challenge those, and to be able to find the right answer. And I said, well, this is the way I should have thought. I said, but where did I begin to think like that anyway? And I began to go back even further to find out where those things were, and I could go all the way back to my youth. So there were other factors like that, and I keep going back and back to kind of challenge those, but to correct those belief systems that I should have learned before. And then later on, it was part of the healing that I needed, and I hadn't realized that, was medicine man told me, he goes, the spirits were talking to me, and he said, what they're saying you need to do is to meditate. And my first response was like, meditate? I was like, our people meditate? Well, he said, well, long ago we did it differently. You sat in nature, you're grounding yourself. And a lot of times it has to do with knowing what's going on and what you have access to. Of course, there's always Mother Earth, trees or stones or many different things that can help you, and to realize those things and speak to them, talk to them. But also within fasting, our fasting practices, in sitting in one place or staying in one place, being out in nature, you begin to feel differently. The longer you're out there, and the more you begin to kind of go back into how you, like with nature, you begin to wake up with the sun, go to sleep with the sun. Your kind of clock ends up, internal clock begins to be more like nature, and you become to be more peaceful within. And a lot of times that is what helped me.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. So moving into the historical trauma part of this presentation, Maria Braveheart, who developed the historical trauma model about 30 years ago, is the lady that we all learn from, I think. And she and I were having a talk a couple of days ago about contemporary times, the coronavirus and historical trauma. And she made a point of saying to me that, we are going through a historically traumatic period right now. All of us in this country, everybody. And it's kind of different that we're all going through this historically traumatic time, and we're all having to make adjustments to how we do our work and how we manage ourselves socially and culturally. We talked about how this traumatic period right now is impacting us, and will continue to have an impact on us down the line. So it was nice to hear her affirm that a couple days ago. Some examples of historical trauma, the Nazi Holocaust, the American Holocaust, which is the Native American Holocaust. It's stated oftentimes that Hitler got ideas and put in place practices for Jewish genocide and genocide of other cultures and people in the areas that he took control of by studying how English and the United States treated American Indians and South Africans through discrimination, and defeated indigenous people by starvation, epidemics, and combat. That his concentration camps were being placed in distant areas for death marches, like forced migrations to reservations. And many of those concentration camps were also in barren places. So this is an example of how historical trauma is not a Native American concept only, and I want to frame again that we are right now living through a historically traumatic time, and as resilient people, we will get through this. Historical trauma symptoms are derived from the loss of in which ancestors and from them experienced traumatic life due to physical, emotional, psychological hardships. Being removed from lands, unexpected changes in environment, laws making our practices illegal, not being able to mourn or pray in the manner that our people were used to. Those are experiences that Native Americans had over centuries of colonization. And historical trauma is the result of a legacy of chronic trauma. That's an important concept, chronic trauma, and unresolved grief across generations, enacted upon them by European dominant culture. This is how Maria Braveheart and De Bruyn define historical trauma. Okay. Went back to the chat real quick. We know that trauma can be passed through descendants, through genes, biologically, but also psychologically through stories, the education system, the environment, and such as students, adults, and by social means. This is where the ACEs model begins to resonate to what we've been talking about for over 30 years in the historical trauma model. Is that we have ACEs experience that span back generations upon generations, back to the beginning of colonization. And we understand that intergenerational trauma will have and does have a significant impact on us. Warriors, chief with special spiritual powers that allowed natives to go unseen, sneak up to the enemy, feel no pain, speak to animals. These are some of the trauma that many Native American veterans experience. I mean, any Native person, especially male who's been in the military, will have been called chief I don't know of any Native who hasn't. And one of the aspects of this kind of expectation that non-Native has, the expectation that all Natives are good in the wilderness, and that we feel no pain, and that we can understand nature better than anybody else, and consequently, I was telling one of my nieces last week. She's joining one of the military branches, and I was telling her to expect these things when she was in the military to be referred to as a warrior, and to be given assignments that were difficult because as a Native woman, she's going to be expected to be having those characteristics of being fearless and being extra brave and being extra resilient. But those expectations were okay, because it would mean that she's going to have to work that much harder to be a very good warrior in the military. And so preparing my young niece for that expectation. And it's just something that happens to all veterans and all Natives who are in active duty. I don't know of very many Natives who don't get special assignments that are extraordinarily difficult or hard or dangerous because of who we are. There are 4 parts to the historical trauma model. Historical trauma is not historical trauma in and of itself. The historical trauma model has 4 parts to it. This is something that Maria Braveheart and I continually discuss, is that when we talk about historical trauma, we talk about it within this framework that is created. And there are 4 components to the historical trauma and understanding grief model, HTUG. And you'll see the one in black is the first component, confronting historical trauma, embracing our history. The component in red is the second component, which is understanding the trauma, and the third component is releasing the pain. The fourth component is transcending that trauma. That's how we return to our sacred path as Native people. And as you see, that the model is cyclical. In other words, it goes in a circle. We confront it. We confront our history. We understand that trauma. We release the pain. We transcend the trauma. Then we move on through our healing process continually. Towards confronting historical trauma, well, Native Americans as a whole, we have encountered colonization since the landing of Columbus, and we have all tribes have experienced forced migration. All tribes have experienced internment. Sometimes, and reservations are basically internment areas. We've all experienced repression of indigenous practices, beliefs, language, and identity, paternalism by government institutions, whether it be the federal government, state government, or even tribal government, has been significant across these decades or centuries, not only by government organizations, but also by religious organizations. And through the reorganization of our traditionally established governance processes, all tribes have tribal governments that are established according to how Indian Reorganization Act is, or the way the federal government said it was going to be back in the early 1900s. So this is how we begin to confront historical trauma. These are things that happened. These are experiences that our ancestors have. There are consequences for these experiences. And one of the major experiences that we've had is the teaching by Euro-Americans that tradition is an enemy of progress. And I'd like to show this because this is actually a sign that was on a billboard in the middle of the Navajo Nation back in the early 1950s. Imagine a billboard that's about 10 by 12 on a major street corner on the Navajo Nation capital. And this is a street sign that was right on the corner. If you're familiar with Winter Rock, there's a little flea market area right on the corner of that intersection is where this sign was posted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs for quite a few years. And this is the American way of colonization. Maria and allies have developed this model where we understand that historical trauma creates symptoms. It's not that different from the ACEs model, in fact. And I got to give credit to Maria for coming up with this and others, and Pamela Thurman, who's online here, for helping emphasize the teachings around this. You know, you see depression, anxiety, anger, loss of sleep, discomfort around non-natives or white people. We experience a lot of shame, a disproportionate amount of substance abuse, fear, distress, isolation, violence, and suicide. These are the symptoms of some of the symptoms of historical trauma that we acknowledge is there. For veterans, from the historical trauma framework, we know that soldiers have been in units that fought against American Native ancestors, you know, the cavalry. And boarding schools were modeled after military training. And so we know that young natives, men and women, young natives, female and female, when they were brought to boarding school, had their hair cut. And that was a significant blow to self-identity and self-concept. And we are oftentimes put into special units or positions or assignments because of those beliefs about conceptualizations about Native Americans, fierceness and resilience, and it creates extra strain on Native Americans who go in. And I think a lot of Native Americans do fairly well with meeting those expectations. We sometimes, I remember when I was in, being expected to live up to the drunken Indian idea that was there, being told constantly that I could drink as much as I want to and drink people under the table. I was always asked if we lived in teepees and that I would show little or no fear of death and injury. Those are things that were spoken all the time are spoken to natives who were in the military, and that's how that is. They were very good runners and very good fighters, and we can forecast the weather. We see. Once again, some of the consequences of how we understand historical trauma to manifest itself. You know, we get to the second component. We understand that all these adverse things that have happened historically to our people has resulted in these things: poverty, discrimination. We have some resilience. We have urban employment, unemployment. We're continually looking for improvement in health care. And on one side of the historical trauma thinking, we have alcoholism, but we also have substantially high rates of abstinence. Native Americans there have been surveys that have found that Native Americans have higher rates of abstinence than other ethnic groups in the United States. We have substantially poor health, but we also work hard at improving our health care. We have quite a few accomplished athletes in Native country who are our athletes are very great. We have substantial problems with poverty, and that results in movement towards the urban centers, and consequently 70% of our people live in urban communities for work and to begin acculturating that way. And our suicide problems and the other problems that we have moved us towards putting in place stronger culturally based services. So this has been a consequence of how we understand these problems that are problems related to unemployment that have resulted in movement towards improved economic development. Our problems with housing have moved us towards developing extended family housing. Our reservations, although landlocked, we're seeing more and more tribes expanding their land holdings the last 20 years. And because we understand that the reservations, the lands that were assigned to tribes are not sufficient to sustain tribal people that live on. We have encountered substantial discrimination from understanding that a number of our people and us as well have worked at becoming resilient and hardened towards those kinds of problems that we encounter. Cultural dissonance is a significant problem that results from centuries of being told that tradition is not valuable or worthy, and then like the question that was asked earlier, when the person is acculturated in the Euro-American way and begins to seek understanding of native ways, there's a dissonance that occurs, and we see that a lot, I think, in native country these days, and contributes to the problems with identity and self-esteem. Cultural dissonance may lead to erroneous interpretations of parent behaviors, creating misunderstandings between home and school. And there are some of us who think about and write about cultural dissonance frequently. So, from that understanding that we develop about historical trauma, and we begin to see some of the stress that comes with that and how it impacts our body. Infections, constricted breathing, how it impacts our mind, negativity, indecision, impaired judgment, as stress impacts our behavior, substance abuse, loss of appetite, loneliness, insomnia. It affects our emotions through our loss of confidence, sometimes indifference, depression, irritability, and also insomnia. These are conditions that begin to occur. Then we get to the third component of the historical trauma model, which is releasing the pain. I like this graphic that was drawn by Navajo medicine man. Navajo medicine man is contemplating a healing way through song and prayer, and that's largely the teaching that comes out of this drawing. By confronting our past and understanding the consequences of that historical trauma, then we begin to become more resilient people. One, we begin to accept change, we become continuous learners, we begin to take charge of our lives and our well-being, we begin to find a sense of purpose, we begin to pay attention to our self-identity, we begin to cultivate healthy relationships, and we take time to reflect. Sometimes that's called mindfulness, being mindful. We begin to skill shift. We begin to develop skills in a number of different ways to help us manage our lives a lot more efficiently and effectively. And this is largely occurs through healing and spirituality. And this is the nice thing I like about this graphic. It puts a lot of concepts into how we begin to resolve the trauma that we've encountered individually and collectively and historically. Then we get to the fourth part of the historical trauma model, which is transcending the trauma. The primary part or way of being and towards transcending the trauma is beginning to acknowledge that we are resilient. And I hear this continually among Native Americans, that we are resilient people. It's very true. We're going through a pandemic right now that has serious fatality rate. Just basically changed life. But I think about this, and I think about our ancestors who encountered European diseases early on, and they saw a loss of life that went up to 90%. And I can imagine the impact that had. But our ancestors lived through that. They carried their traditions, their cultures, their value, and lifestyles through that because of their resilience. And I think about that today, and I think that as Native people, we carry that resilience with us. Not only do we carry trauma with us, but we also carry resilience from them through those teachings and the ways that they've lived their life. And that's how we begin to transcend the trauma that is there historically and the trauma that we encounter today. And so from here we're going to move on to Objective 4, where we talk about PTSD. Sean, do you want to take this on?
Okay, so with PTSD, there's different levels of it, different areas you might want to look at. So post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember, like post comes after the exposure to a traumatic event. However, not everyone exposed to trauma develops PTSD. So several factors have been identified through research that increase the likelihood of that one develops PTSD. Remember that the more trauma that one experiences in their life, the more of a chance they have of developing PTSD. So these factors are broken down into three categories, which is pre-trauma, paratrauma, and post-trauma. So pre-trauma is before the trauma. So as we look at this, you have different things to look at, like females. So female gender, they see trauma coming. You have like with natives, there's been a lot of like missing indigenous women. There's been a lot of abuse with women. Younger age of the time of exposure to a traumatic event. As if you're too young or so young that you can't understand or what is happening and how to process this, it may bother you. Racial, ethnic minority status, of course, history of trauma. So the more trauma that one experiences in their life, more likelihood of developing trauma. Familial history of psychiatric disorders. So if there's any psychiatric disorders in the family, depression, anything like that. Pre-existing psychological disorders, unstable or abusive family experiences during childhood, genetic predisposition. So if there's been PTSD in the past, it may come again. Looking at paratrauma, this is what's happening during the trauma. So here are some different articles and stuff, you can look at that. Severity of trauma, perceptions of potential for injury or death, dissociation from traumatic events as it occurs, strong emotional reactions, exposure to horrific events. So remember, then again, post-trauma is after the trauma. So they look at things like such as lack of social support, what happens afterwards, and how that person's going to be able to be supported by family or loved ones, those who care, or whether they're going to get treatment. So PTSD among American Indians, Alaska Native populations, they have found overall higher rate of PTSD in most ethnic minority veterans compared to white veterans. Another study compared to rates of PTSD by ethnicity among Vietnam veterans found higher prevalence of both 1 month and lifetime PTSD among American Indians compared to white veterans. A lot of times what we've seen, though, is because of the way that society and look at movies and things like we were growing up, how these native had these supernatural skills or abilities to be able to do all these things. This kind of comes into play while people are in the military. So what happens is because they believe that natives probably don't need glasses, they can sense all these different things about them. Sometimes they might be put on point where they're going through the jungles or something like that, so that they would be able to help keep people safe. I mean, some of these things actually have happened in the past. I know that there have been people who would be able to or, um, sense some missiles coming, bombs, things like that, before they even hit. So they'd already run, and so people might pay attention to them. But a lot of times they're put into many more of the elite units, such as scouts or rangers, special forces, things like that. One study compared the rates of PTSD between male and female Americans and Indian veterans. More PTSD symptoms were reported by male veterans. A lot of times it has to do with the roles they played in the military. So a lot of times males were in combat roles. So they're the ones who are normally like, seeing most of the action and stuff like that. This may change with future generations. You'll see that more women are increasingly put into combat zones. Not sure how you feel about that. I know that within the military, it's always been kind of a discussion whether they would be allowed to or not. There are women who could do that. That's definitely true. Okay, so then this is follow-up. So we can do introductory presentations with tribal leaders, provide things for the Veterans Wellness Courts. We can adapt the Veterans Wellness curriculum to tribally specific tribal leaders, providers, and tribal veterans in different areas. We can provide local trainings, tribal co-trainers. Remember, that's like 2.5 to 3 days of training. We can do trainer of trainers, develop tribal trainers to incorporate the modules in tribal systems or courts. We would really, but a lot of times what we do with these native veterans, we actually give them after the training, we give them all the different information that we have collected so that they can develop their own programs within their tribes as well. So at this time, I guess not a whole lot of time left, but is there any questions?
You can type your questions in the chat box so we can look at that. Nick Henry thanks Brandon for providing us a link to look at later on down the line. Or Nick provided a link for us to check out later on down the line. Thank you, Nick, for doing that. Okay, and Ray, yeah, thank you for joining us and sharing some of your time with us today. Enjoy, So I want to remind everyone that the presentation is going to be available. It's going to be saved online as well as the handouts, or there'll be copies of the handouts also. So I hope you enjoyed our talk today, and you all take care of yourselves and be safe. And the days ahead of you.
Ray,
Yeah.
this open for a couple more questions?
Yep.
Okay. I just said, do you want me to keep this open a couple more minutes for questions, and then?
Yeah, I think people are making comments on different things.
Yeah, it looks like everybody's.
I see Tyann Benali's been on too. Thank you, Tyann, for joining us, and Patrick Looking Horse. Sean, he has a question for you.
Yeah, Patrick says, when are we going to start putting on workshops in Train the Trainer? Yes, that is exactly what
we're doing that at the present moment. If you would like us to train in your area, let us know, and we can try to get to where you're at. And then we can, after hearing the training and stuff, we can, when we're in your area and stuff like that, have you come and train. I know sometimes we also do trainings in some of the wellness courts or treatment courts, veteran courts, drug courts, things like that.
It looks like Sheila has a question. Is there any special mindfulness geared for Native Alaska Native?
Well, traditionally, mindfulness, what's considered to be mindfulness in the Euro-American framework, was very well established and practiced in the traditional society. And the teaching was for always one to be aware about surroundings and thinking and feelings and behavior, to have a real strong self-awareness and to be able to move through life that way. So that was traditionally practiced through colonization, of course, and the movement towards assimilation. Many of our tribal ways have not continued that on. It could have been, but yes, Sheila, there are frameworks out there in traditional communities for that. So we've got a minute left, and I want to once again thank everyone for joining us. Sean and I appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you. And if you would like our contact information, let Megan know. We are both very, I think we'd like to do follow up with anybody who has questions or ideas. This is a working process. If you have ideas on content, please let us know. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray and Sean. I really appreciate your time today, and everyone that has the opportunity to join us. I could just remind you that we will send out follow-up email, which will include handouts of the slides, a CEU request form, and a link to the survey, and a link to the recording in case you'd like to view it again, share it with colleagues, or if you couldn't hear anything or see something today, like I saw for a few of you. We just want to thank you again for joining us, and I hope this was helpful. And please let us know if there's anything else that you need in the future from us. Thank you, Ray and Sean. Everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, one thing I remember about this is that this is only a small portion of this module. Really, this will take a lot longer. We have a lot more information if we do the training. Thank you.